So, throughout the 16th century and going into the early 17th century, European countries, especially France, were very Catholic-centric. Any beliefs that you had to be quote-unquote proven by the Bible. That was until the Enlightenment in the 17th century, which then led to revolutions like the American French and even some Latin revolutions that no one really talks about. But I'm going to be talking more about that today. Welcome to the video. So, as I said in the intro, throughout the 16th century and any time before that, any beliefs that anyone had to be based around the Bible. For example, the geocentric theory, which was a Bible-based belief, said the Earth was the center of the universe. This was wrong, but no one ever really questioned it because you had to listen to the Catholic Church. That was until the 17th century where a bunch of scientists and scholars started appearing all over Europe, especially France. This led to scientific advances in astronomy, which led to the heliocentric theory. There were advances in botany, people studying plants, advances in medicine and chemistry, so people would actually be told to wash their hands, and even studies in physics, which helped out with astronomy. So there are a lot of important figures that came from this Enlightenment. I could talk about all of them, but I am only going to talk about the main four, because frankly these Enlightenment figures could take its own video. So let's talk about the most important one right off the bat, John Locke. He did a lot in terms of evolving America and Europe's government. He believed that people should be born free and equal, and that they should have the rights of life, liberty, and property, and that the government should protect these rights, and failure in doing so would get them overthrown by, guess who? The citizens. There's also people like Montesquieu, who believed that the government should have 3 separate branches, and each branch should check and balance the other branches, so that there was never anything unequal. There was also Voltaire. This man was a writer. He wrote over 70 books and essays, and he fought for the rights of tolerance, reason, freedom of religion, and speech. And this person wasn't as important in terms of the topic of government, but Mary Wollstonecraft has to be mentioned. She was a women's rights activist and believed that women should be given the same rights and opportunities as men. Without her, I don't know where we would be today. So now I've talked about the initial start of the Enlightenment and its figures and ideas. Let's talk about how these ideas were spread across Europe. A man by the name of Dennis Diderot published the Encyclopedia. It had a lot of these Enlightenment ideas inside of it, and although it did severely anger the French government and the Catholic Church, it was still mass published and spread across European nations. With this publication also came the Renaissance, which was this time of elegancy and symphony. Classical music was mass made. Novels that included plots and unique characters were made. Paris ended up becoming a big place of travel because of all these ideas and novels and music. Salons started opening up all across Europe, which were places where Enlightenment thinkers could share and explain their ideas. The style was very neoclassic. It was very refined and elegant. Monarchs also played a very interesting role during this time. There were things called enlightened despots, which were people, primarily leaders, who didn't want to give up their rule but wanted to encourage and support these Enlightenment ideas. So while France was having their Renaissance with classical music and the beginnings of novels, the US was dealing with their own issues. See, during the times of the Renaissance for the French was also the beginning of the American Revolution for, guess what, the US. This revolution was a result of many reasons. To begin with, the US was under the rule of the British monarch, yet they had no say in Parliament. So any laws that were made in Britain also went over to the US, but they had no say. There was also incredibly high taxes on imported items such as tea and paper and a lot of other stuff. Then they decided to break away from England and setting off their revolution. So throughout them going through their revolution, they had the creation of several documents. To begin with, they had the Declaration of Independence. This document was highly inspired by the writings and tellings of John Locke, who we said in the beginning believed that men should be created equal, should have their natural rights, which were changed in America, but same principles, which were life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And also they were given the right to overthrow the government. So since they won independence, which resulted in them creating, guess what, the Declaration of Independence, they needed a new government. Thus they created the Constitution, which was inspired by Montesquieu, who, as we said, they now had 3 branches of government: the legislature, the judicial, and the executive. And they also had their checks and balances. They also created created the Bill of Rights, which is inspired by Voltaire, who said that there should be a freedom of speech and religion, and that there should be no cruel or unusual punishment. So since America sorted out their revolution and they now had their new documents, the French were inspired by the Americans and decided to start a revolution of their own. So they also had their own reasons for their revolution. Some of them included, well, of course, the Enlightenment writers. There were also big inequalities in society. At the time, France was split up into 3 different estates. There was the first estate, which consisted of the Catholic clergy and was only 1% of the population and did not pay any taxes. There was the second estate, which were the nobles, which were 2% of the population and held key government positions. And then there was the third estate, which took up 97% of the population and was the working class, the bourgeoisie, and they were very poor, and they paid a majority of the taxes. There was also the fact that at the time the French leader, Louis XIV, was a terrible leader. He was very shy and indecisive, and was also very young. And not only was their king a terrible leader, but also who he was married to. Marie Antoinette, also called Madame Deficit, was known for flaunting her money and making poor financial decisions. So, during these meetings with the 3 estates, called the Estates General, the third estate had very little say. Thus, they decided to make a new group called the National Assembly. But because of this, the third estate got locked out of the room where the Estates General would be held. So then they decided to break into an indoor tennis court and refuse to leave until they had a brand new constitution. So King Louis did not enjoy this very much, so he decides to break up the Estates General and sends out troops to kill citizens. But those who were seeing their people being killed didn't take this lightly. They robbed the biggest prison and also the armory in France, called the Bastille, and chaos started to ensue. Houses were being burnt. They were tearing up their papers that had their taxes on it. Then the drought and hunger started to hit. Eventually, the women of France stood up and traveled to the Versailles, which is where the king and queen lived, and forced King Louis to move to Paris and see what his country was dealing with. So, as the king witnessed all of this revolution, it was officially decided that in 1789, there would be a reformation in France. There was the creation of the Declaration of Man, which was similar to a combination of the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. They also allowed the National Assembly to make changes in the church, government, and the king's power. And there was also the creation of the Legislative Assembly, who declared or rejected war and also created laws in France. Also with this, there was the creation of 3 groups, who were the radicals, who wanted a lot of reform, the moderates, who wanted some reform, and conservatives, who wanted little to no reform. So even though things were looking brighter for France, there was suddenly a twist. And this twist was the Reign of Terror. It began shortly after war was declared on Austria and Prussia, and the National Convention and Republic were officially set up. As soon as these things started, there was a group called the Jacobins who began appearing along France. They were a radical group who ended up being the ones to behead King Louis XVI. The leader of this group was Maximilien Robespierre. He was the leader of Committee of Public Safety, which will become ironic as soon as I mention that he ended up killing approximately 4 to 5 people each day via the guillotine as soon as King Louis XVI was beheaded. He believed that terror equals justice, but this ended up getting him guillotined. As soon as this man was guillotined, a man named Napoleon was seen rising in the military. He was a military genius. He won a lot of battles in Italy, and in 1799 carried out a coup d'etat. He ended up defeating British, Russians, Austrians, and many other European armies, and they all feared him. Because of this, Napoleon eventually gets rule, and he creates Napoleonic Code, which made citizens equal, but is ironic based on the fact that this code limited the freedom of speech and restored slavery to France. Eventually, in 1804, he made himself the Emperor of France. Now, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Sweden were all watching this from afar, and this set them off and made them hate Napoleon in France. So they officially declared war. Napoleon fought and forced Russia, Austria, and Sweden to sign a treaty, which left Britain to be taken by Napoleon, or so he thought. This is where the Battle of Trafalgar occurred. This was a naval battle between Britain and the French and Spanish Navy. Now, the issue with this battle that Napoleon didn't realize is that Britain were pros at commanding and leading naval attacks. So, guess what? Napoleon ended up losing, and Britain held the strongest navy for the next 100 years. This was the only battle that Napoleon ever lost. So, now at this point, Britain, Portugal, Sweden, and Ottomans were the only European countries that weren't entirely controlled by Napoleon. Now, as with every empire, and frankly anything, Napoleon's empire was soon to fall. Now, there were three costly mistakes to Napoleon's empire, which were the continental system, which was an attempt to block British ships from entering France and to try and make Europe more sufficient, but failed because of smuggling. The Peninsular War, which Napoleon lost 300,000 troops due to nationalist rebels, and also his attempted invasion of Russia, where the Russians used the scorched earth policy and destroyed a bunch of crops and livestock, and he ended up losing again thousands of troops. So eventually Britain, Prussia, Sweden, Russia, and Austria all joined against Napoleon, and as Napoleon tries his best to fight, he continues to lose and was eventually exiled. Then he tried to fight again, but there was the battle in Waterloo led by the Duke of Wellington, and ended after 100 days. And eventually Napoleon was finally sent off to St. Helena and died there in 1821. Because of Napoleon finally being exiled, the European nations need to finally pick themselves back up and start all over again. Thus led to the creation of the Congress of Vienna. Their general goals were to restore a balance of power in Europe and prevent any aggression from the French in the future, and generally stifle revolutions. So the members / representatives of the Congress were the countries of Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, and France. They ended up making new boundaries and contained France and separated Napoleon's gained territories equally amongst the nations. So the legacy they left behind were a few short-term legacies. There was a temporary balance of power, which led to a time of peace, and a general political triumph for the first while, and no one was ever left out during this Congress. But the long-term gain from this was that there was a diminished power of France, there was an increased power in Britain and Russia, there was a spread of nationalism, and there was an increase in democratic ideas around the world. So here's future editing Simon here. Sorry that this video got cut short and I didn't talk about the Haitian revolutions and the Latin American revolutions. I had some technical difficulties last minute, and it just couldn't fit in, and also why the editing is very poor for the last, general voiceover bit of the video. I apologize deeply, and maybe I'll try to remake this video, but a lot better, because this just was not great, but I'm turning on what I can. I apologize, and thanks for watching, I suppose.